The morphine drip wasn't working fast enough. I watched my father's face contort in agony as the cancer ate through his liver, and for the first time in either of my lives, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The man who had beaten me senseless for getting a B+ in chemistry was now begging me, the daughter he'd disowned, to save his life. "Please, Mira," he wheezed, his once powerful hands trembling as they reached for mine. "You're the only one who can help me. The doctors say you're some kind of miracle worker now." I pulled my hands away and adjusted my white coat. At 28 in this life, I was already the youngest department head in the hospital's history. The nameplate on my chest read Dr. Mira Chen, Chief of Oncological Surgery. The medical knowledge from my previous 43 years as a world-renowned surgeon, combined with the desperate hunger for validation that had driven me to excel beyond all reason, had made me unstoppable. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chen," I said, using his surname deliberately. "I don't treat patients with a history of domestic violence." The fear in his eyes was delicious. Behind him, my stepmother Linda shifted nervously, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the metal rail of his hospital bed. My half-sister Jessica stood in the corner, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like armor. They'd all come crawling back now that they needed me. "Mira, honey," Linda said in that saccharine voice that had fooled everyone but me. "Surely you can't hold childhood grudges forever. We're family." I almost laughed. Family. These people had systematically destroyed every ounce of self-worth I'd possessed in my first life, and now they wanted to claim familial bonds? Childhood grudges, I repeated slowly, savoring each word. Is that what we're calling 22 years of systematic abuse? Jessica stepped forward, her face flushed with the same righteous indignation she'd worn whenever I dared to speak up as children. "You always were so dramatic, Mira. Dad made mistakes, but he tried his best." Tried his best? The words came out sharper than I'd intended, causing the heart monitor to beep faster as my father's stress levels spiked. "Let me tell you about his best, Jessica. His best was throwing me down the stairs when I was 12 because I asked for lunch money. His best was locking me in the basement for 3 days when I was 14 because I talked back by asking why you got a car for your 16th birthday while I got a part-time job to pay for my own school supplies." The room fell silent except for the steady mechanical breathing of the ventilator and the soft beeping of monitors. I could see the exact moment they realized this wasn't going to be the easy reconciliation they'd planned. It had taken me 28 years to get to this moment, but I remembered every detail of my first life with crystal clarity. I remembered the night he'd thrown a medical textbook at my head because I'd asked for help with organic chemistry. I remembered him screaming that I was worthless, that I'd never amount to anything, that he wished I'd never been born. I remembered Linda standing by, not lifting a finger to help, too concerned with protecting her own precious Jessica to care about the stepdaughter she'd never wanted. Most vividly, I remembered the night I'd graduated medical school, the night he'd finally gone too far. I'd come home with my diploma, desperate for even a crumb of approval after 26 years of trying to earn his love. Instead, I'd found him burning my acceptance letter to Johns Hopkins surgical residency program. He'd been drunk, ranting about how I thought I was better than the family, how I was an ungrateful bitch who needed to be taken down a peg. When I'd tried to save the letter from the flames, he'd shoved me so hard I'd cracked my skull on the corner of the marble coffee table, a table Linda had insisted on buying with money that should have gone toward my student loans. The last thing I'd seen in that life was his face, not concerned or remorseful, but annoyed that I'd bled on Linda's precious Persian rug. Then I'd woken up as a 6-year-old again, with 4 decades of medical knowledge and a burning need for justice. The transition had been jarring. One moment I'd been Dr. Mira Chen, age 43, dying alone on my childhood living room floor. The next, I was 6-year-old Mira again, small and vulnerable, but armed with knowledge that would take me decades to acquire naturally. At first, I thought it was a dream. But when my father came home that night, 3 hours late and reeking of alcohol just like I remembered, and raised his hand to strike me for spilling juice on his newspaper, I'd known it was real. The sting of his palm against my cheek was exactly as I remembered it, but this time, I'd been ready. "Daddy," I'd said in my sweetest 6-year-old voice. "Mrs. Patterson next door asked me to tell you that if you keep hitting me, she's going to call the police again." He'd frozen, his hand still raised. Mrs. Patterson had never said any such thing in my first life, but she'd always been suspicious of the bruises. The threat was just plausible enough to make him hesitate. She said judges don't like it when daddies hurt little girls. I'd continued, my voice carefully innocent. She said they take daddies away forever sometimes. That had been my first victory, small but significant. He'd lowered his hand and stalked away, muttering under his breath. For the rest of that week, he'd been careful to hit me only where the bruises wouldn't show. This time, I'd been smarter. This time, I'd documented everything. The first beating came when I was 8, just like before. But this time, I'd had a recording device hidden in my backpack. A small digital recorder I'd convinced my teacher I needed for a school project. The device captured not just the sound of his belt against my skin, but his words. "You're nothing but a burden. I should have listened to Linda when she said we should send you away." The second major incident came at 10. This time, I'd gotten photos of the bruises using an old digital camera I'd found in the school's lost and found. I'd also written detailed medical assessments of my injuries in my own hand, using knowledge far beyond my apparent years. Hairline fracture of the left radius. Contusions consistent with blunt force trauma. Patterned bruising suggesting use of an implement. Any adult reading those reports would have known immediately that no 10-year-old could have written them. But I'd been careful to hide them well, saving them for the moment when they'd have maximum impact. By the time I was 12, I'd amassed enough evidence to bury him. But I'd wanted more than just his imprisonment. I'd wanted his complete and utter destruction, so I'd excelled. I'd become the perfect daughter in public, straight A's, early admission to advanced placement programs, science fair victories, academic scholarships. Every achievement was a nail in his coffin, because each one came with documentation of how he'd tried to stop me. The full scholarship to MIT that he'd tried to sabotage by hiding my application? I'd applied in secret through my guidance counselor and recorded him destroying the first acceptance letter I'd let him find. "Ungrateful brat thinks she's too good for community college," he'd snarled, holding the letter over the kitchen sink lighter. "I'll show her what happens to girls who get too big for their britches." I'd watched from the stairway, my phone recording every word. In my backpack was the real acceptance letter, along with 3 backup copies I'd requested from admissions. The research grant he'd attempted to steal when I was 16 by forging my signature on the application documents. I'd set up the whole scenario, knowing his greedy nature would make him incapable of resisting the bait. $20,000 for a high school student's independent research project had been too tempting for him to let me keep. I'd printed out fake bank documents showing the money deposited in his account, left them where Linda would find them, and waited. The explosion had been spectacular. "You stole from your own daughter?" Linda had screamed, her voice carrying through the thin walls of our house. "From a child?" "She doesn't need that money," he'd shouted back. "She's just going to waste it on some stupid science nonsense anyway. At least this way, it'll go towards something useful." "Useful like what? Your gambling debts? Your drinking problem? The money you've been stealing from my jewelry box?" That fight had lasted 3 days and ended with Linda packing Jessica's bags and moving in with her mother for 2 weeks. I'd savored every moment of their misery, knowing that I was the architect of their destruction. The medical breakthrough that had made me famous worldwide, a revolutionary surgical technique that I'd developed at 25. I'd deliberately delayed publishing it until after he'd publicly claimed that his daughter was a failure who'd never accomplish anything meaningful. The technique itself was something I'd perfected in my previous life, a minimally invasive approach to removing pancreatic tumors that increased survival rates by 40%. In my first life, I'd developed it at age 35 and published it immediately, desperate for recognition. This time, I'd waited. I'd needed him to make his statements publicly, permanently, and in a way that would maximize his humiliation when I proved him wrong. So, I'd let him think I was struggling. I'd let him believe his sabotage was working. At family gatherings, he'd held court, talking about how I was wasting my potential and too stubborn to accept help, and destined to fail because she doesn't know her place. Linda would nod along sympathetically while Jessica smirked from across the room. "Mark my words," he'd said at Christmas dinner when I was 24, his voice loud enough for all the relatives to hear. "That girl will never amount to anything. She's got delusions of grandeur, thinks she's smarter than everyone else. But reality has a way of humbling people like her. I'd recorded every word. 6 months later, when my technique was featured on the cover of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I was invited to present at the International Conference on Surgical Innovation, I'd made sure copies of that recording were sent to every person who'd been at that dinner. Every move had been calculated, every success had been weaponized. The real beauty of my plan wasn't just in the individual victories, though. It was in the systematic way I'd dismantled every aspect of their lives while building up my own. I'd started small, anonymous tips to the IRS about my father's under-the-table construction business, a casual mention to Linda's boss that she'd been using company resources for personal projects, a well-timed revelation to Jessica's high school boyfriend that she'd been cheating on him with 3 other guys. As I'd gotten older and more successful, my methods had become more sophisticated. I'd used my medical connections to ensure that my father's insurance company received detailed reports about his drinking problem, leading to policy cancellations and premium increases. I'd leveraged my research credentials to get Linda blacklisted from the charity organizations where she'd built her social standing. I'd used my growing influence in academic circles to make sure that Jessica's applications to medical school, her pathetic attempt to compete with my success, were quietly rejected by every institution that mattered. By the time I'd reached the peak of my career, they were isolated, financially struggling, and completely dependent on the reputation I'd systematically destroyed for them. Now, at 28, I was Dr. Mira Chen, chief of oncological surgery at one of the country's most prestigious hospitals. I had a corner office overlooking the city, a research lab with a budget in the millions, and the respect of colleagues around the world. My techniques had saved thousands of lives. My innovations had advanced the field of surgery by decades. And my father was dying, and he'd come crawling to me because his insurance had been mysteriously canceled. I'd made sure his claims history showed a pattern of high-risk behaviors that made him uninsurable. His bank accounts had been mysteriously frozen. A few well-placed tips about suspicious financial activity had triggered federal investigations. Every other competent oncologist in the city had mysteriously become unavailable. I'd quietly used my professional network to ensure that anyone capable of performing the surgery he needed was either out of the country, overbooked, or simply uninterested in taking his case. It had taken careful orchestration. I'd needed him desperate enough to come to me, but not so close to death that saving him would be impossible. The timing had to be perfect. "Mira, please," my mother whispered from the corner of the private room I'd arranged for this meeting. I'd almost forgotten she was there. My biological mother, Sarah, had remarried my father when I was 4, bringing me into this family hell. She looked 20 years older than her actual age, worn down by decades of emotional abuse and neglect. In my first life, she died when I was 32, her spirit completely broken by years of watching her daughter suffer while being powerless to stop it. This time, I'd made sure she received the help she needed. Anonymous therapy sessions, quietly paid for through a medical charity I'd established, support group referrals, even a new job at a company whose HR director owed me a favor. She was stronger now, but still haunted by decades of trauma. "He's your father," she said, her voice barely audible. "No," I said calmly, opening the thick folder I'd brought with me. "A father protects his children. A father nurtures them. A father loves them." I pulled out the first photograph. My 8-year-old face, swollen and bruised. This is what a monster does. My father's eyes widened as I spread the evidence across his hospital bed. Photos, audio recordings, medical reports, financial documents showing how he'd stolen money from my college fund, testimonies from teachers who'd witnessed his verbal abuse during parent conferences, copies of police reports from neighbors who'd called in domestic disturbances. "You documented everything," he breathed, his voice weak but still carrying that note of disbelief that had always infuriated me. "Everything," I confirmed, "including the fact that you've been systematically destroying every opportunity I've ever had, right up until last month, when you tried to sabotage my research grant application." His face went white. That was something only the 3 of us were supposed to know about. Him, me, and the grants administrator, who'd received his forged letter claiming I was mentally unstable and unfit for research funding. "How did you—" "I've been watching you my entire life," I said, pulling out a thick stack of papers. Waiting for this moment. Do you know what it's like to be 6 years old and already know that your father is going to try to kill your dreams before you're old enough to even understand what dreams are? I spread out more documents. Financial records showing how he'd diverted money from my mother's life insurance policy. Email printouts proving he'd contacted my high school guidance counselor to recommend against my AP placement. Phone records documenting his calls to university admissions offices, claiming to be a concerned parent reporting his daughter's psychological issues. This is 22 years of systematic sabotage, I continued, my voice clinically detached. Every time I succeeded despite your efforts, you found new ways to tear me down. When I graduated valedictorian, you told everyone I'd cheated. When I got into MIT, you spread rumors that I'd slept with the admissions officer. When I published my first research paper, you called the journal to claim I'd plagiarized it. Linda was backing toward the door now, her face pale. Mira, honey, you're being unreasonable. Your father made mistakes, but... Mistakes? I turned to face her, and she actually flinched. Let's talk about your mistakes, Linda. Like the time you threw away my science fair project the night before the competition because Jessica was jealous that mine was better. Or the time you accidentally gave my prom dress to Goodwill and then acted surprised when I had nothing to wear. Or the 17 different occasions when you told people I was adopted because you didn't want them to think your stepdaughter's failures reflected on your parenting. I pulled out another file, this one labeled with Linda's name. Did you think I wouldn't find out about the college fund my mother left for me? The one you and my father drained to pay for Jessica's sorority fees? That's not, Linda stammered. $53,000, I said, consulting the documents. Gone, along with the savings bonds my grandmother left me, the inheritance from my mother's life insurance, and the money I earned working 3 jobs throughout high school. Jessica finally found her voice. You can't blame us for your problems forever, Mira. Maybe if you hadn't been so difficult, so hostile all the time. Difficult, I repeated, savoring the word. I was difficult. Let me tell you what difficult looks like, Jessica. I turned to face my half-sister fully, noting how she'd positioned herself behind our father's bed, as if it could protect her from my words. Difficult is a 6-year-old trying to explain to her teacher why she can't concentrate in class because she's been locked in a basement all weekend. Difficult is a 10-year-old working 2 paper routes to buy her own school supplies while watching her half-sister get a new laptop just because she asked for one. Difficult is a 16-year-old girl having panic attacks because her family has convinced her she's worthless, stupid, and destined to fail. My voice was rising now, years of suppressed rage finally finding their voice. Difficult is spending your first life believing that the abuse was somehow your fault, that you deserved it, that you were fundamentally broken and unlovable. Difficult is dying at 43 without ever knowing what it felt like to have a family that actually cared about your happiness. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the machines seemed to quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Your first life? My father whispered. I smiled, cold and sharp. Oh, did I forget to mention that part? I died, Dad. At 43, alone in the living room where you used to beat me. I bled out on Linda's precious Persian rug after you shoved me into the coffee table for trying to save my acceptance letter from the flames. I could see the exact moment he understood what I was saying. His face went gray, and not just from the cancer. That's impossible, Linda breathed. Is it? I asked. How else would I know that you're going to try to steal Dad's pain medication to sell to your book club friends? How else would I know that Jessica's been embezzling money from her employer for the past 6 months? How else would I know that Dad's been hiding a second family in Denver for the past 8 years? The heart monitor started beeping erratically as my father's stress levels spiked. Linda let out a small gasp while Jessica's face went white. You're lying, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a photo. This is Rebecca Martinez and her daughter Sophia. Sophia just turned 7. She has your eyes, Dad. Rebecca thinks you're a traveling businessman named Michael Chen who's been supporting them with regular monthly payments. She has no idea you're married to Linda. I swiped to another photo. This is the house you bought them in Lakewood. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, nice neighborhood. The mortgage is in your name, of course. Monthly payment of $2,400, which explains why you've been so cash poor lately. Linda was staring at the phone screen with a mixture of horror and fury. 8 years? She whispered. 8 years, I confirmed, starting right around the time Jessica graduated high school and you started talking about renewing your vows. Funny timing, don't you think? I can explain, my father started, but Linda cut him off. Explain what? How you've been lying to me for 8 years? How you've been supporting another woman and child while I've been working double shifts to keep us afloat? How you made me feel guilty for spending money on groceries while you were paying for another family's house? The family was imploding just as I'd planned, but I wasn't done yet. There's more, I said calmly. Jessica, would you like to tell everyone about the embezzlement, or should I? My half-sister's face crumpled. How could you possibly know about that? Because I know everything, I said simply. I know about the $47,000 you've stolen from the children's charity where you work. I know about the fake receipts, the phantom vendors, the cash withdrawals you've been covering up with creative bookkeeping. I know that your boss is planning to confront you about it next Tuesday, and I know that you've been planning to blame it on your assistant. Jessica sank into the chair beside the bed, her hands shaking. I was going to pay it back. I just needed time. Time for what? To finish paying off your gambling debts? To cover the credit card bills from your shopping addiction? To pay back the money you borrowed from Dad's construction business without telling him? I turned back to my father, whose face had gone from gray to green. Oh, yes, he knows about that too now. $23,000 gone. She's been forging your signature on company checks for months. The machines were beeping frantically now as my father's blood pressure spiked. A nurse appeared in the doorway, drawn by the alarms, but I waved her away. We're having a family discussion, I told her smoothly. Nothing to worry about. When she was gone, I continued. This is what you built, Dad. This is the family you created with your lies, your violence, your systematic destruction of anyone who threatened your fragile ego. A wife who steals medication to feed her own addictions. A daughter who embezzles from children's charities. And a second family you've been lying to for nearly a decade. I leaned closer to his bed, my voice dropping to a whisper. Do you want to know what the really beautiful part is? In my first life, I spent 43 years trying to win your approval. I thought if I could just be good enough, smart enough, successful enough, you might finally love me. I died believing that I was the problem. I straightened up, smoothing my lab coat. But this time, I know the truth. You're not capable of love. You're a broken, pathetic man who was so threatened by his daughter's potential that you spent 2 decades trying to destroy it. And the best part? I became everything you were afraid I'd become anyway. I pulled out a thick legal document from my folder. This is a restraining order that goes into effect the moment you're discharged from this hospital. You are never to contact me again. You are never to speak my name in public. You are never to claim any connection to my success. But the cancer will kill you in approximately 6 months without treatment, I said clinically. There is exactly one surgical procedure that could save you, and I'm the only surgeon in the world qualified to perform it. I had perfected the technique in my previous life after spending years studying cases exactly like his. The survival rate with my procedure was 97%. Without it, he had perhaps a 5% chance of living another year. Unfortunately for you, I continued, I have a strict policy against treating monsters. He tried to sit up, desperation making him wild. I'll pay you anything. I'll give you the house, the business, everything. I already own the house, I said pleasantly. Bought it last week when the bank foreclosed on your mortgage. The business too, actually. Funny how quickly things fall apart when your illegal tax shelters get reported to the IRS. The machine monitoring his heart rate started beeping faster. Linda gasped, finally understanding the full scope of what I'd done. You did this, my father whispered. You destroyed everything. I simply returned the favor, I said. Every opportunity you stole from me, every dream you crushed, every time you made me feel worthless, I've given it all back to you with interest. I stood and smoothed my coat, preparing to leave, but then I paused as if remembering something. Actually, I'm not entirely without mercy. I'll make you a deal. Hope flickered in his eyes, pathetic and desperate. Get on your knees and beg my forgiveness for every single thing you've ever done to me. List them all. Every beating, every cruel word, every time you sabotaged my future. Apologize for all of it and mean it, and I'll consider treating you. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of machines and his labored breathing. I can't, he whispered, not in front of them. Then you'll die, I said simply, because this is the only chance you're getting. For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then, with enormous effort, he tried to swing his legs over the side of the bed. What are you doing? Linda asked, rushing to his side. What she wants, he said bitterly, what I should have done years ago. It took him almost 5 minutes to get to his knees beside the hospital bed. He was shaking from the effort, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. The cancer had ravaged his body, leaving him a shadow of the intimidating man who had terrorized my childhood. When he finally looked up at me, there were tears in his eyes. I'm sorry, he began, his voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry for hitting you when you asked for help with homework. I'm sorry for calling you worthless. I'm sorry for burning your acceptance letters. The list went on for 20 minutes. Every incident I'd documented, plus dozens more that I'd never been able to prove, but that he remembered with crystal clarity. He confessed to stealing my scholarship money, to sabotaging my job interviews, to spreading lies about me to extended family members. He admitted to being jealous of my intelligence, threatened by my potential, afraid that my success would make his own failures more obvious. My mother sobbed quietly in the corner as the full scope of his abuse was laid bare. Linda stood frozen by the door, her face pale with shock. Jessica had buried her head in her hands, unable to watch. I'm sorry for locking you in the basement, he continued, his voice breaking. I'm sorry for making you work 3 jobs while Jessica got everything handed to her. I'm sorry for telling you that you'd never amount to anything. I'm sorry for making you believe that you were worthless. He looked up at me, and for the first time in either of my lives, I saw something that might have been genuine remorse in his eyes. I was wrong about everything, he whispered. You're brilliant and successful, and you became everything I was too small to see you could become. I destroyed my own family because I couldn't stand the thought of my daughter being better than me. I'm sorry, Mira. I'm so sorry. The room was silent except for the quiet crying of the women and the steady beeping of the machines keeping him alive. He stayed on his knees, looking up at me with desperate hope, waiting for my response. I looked down at him, this man who had loomed so large in my nightmares for 2 lifetimes, now broken and pathetic on the floor, and felt the last of my anger drain away. Thank you, I said quietly. That's all I ever wanted to hear. Then I walked toward the door. Wait, he called out, his voice cracking with desperation. You said you'd consider treating me? I paused with my hand on the door handle. I did consider it. The answer is no. But I apologized. I did everything you asked. Yes, you did. I turned back to look at him one last time. And now you know what it feels like to do everything right and still be rejected. Consider it a learning experience. The sound of his sobbing followed me into the hallway, where I ran into Dr. Martinez, my colleague and the only other oncologist in the city qualified to attempt the surgery my father needed. How did it go? She asked gently. She knew the full story. I'd needed a witness to my father's condition for legal purposes, and Carmen had volunteered when I'd explained the situation. Exactly as planned, I said. He's all yours now if you want him. Pro bono case, of course. I'll cover all the costs. She nodded thoughtfully. I'll do what I can, but without your technique. He has a 15% chance of survival with standard procedures, I finished. Better odds than he gave me. Carmen studied my face carefully. Are you sure about this, Mira? I know what he did to you, but you're not him. You don't have to become the monster to defeat the monster. I considered her words for a moment. I'm not becoming a monster, Carmen. I'm choosing not to save one. There's a difference. Is there? She asked softly. My technique could save him, I said. But it could also save dozens of other people. People who didn't spend decades destroying their children's lives for sport. I have limited time, limited energy, limited emotional capacity. I choose to spend those resources on people who deserve them. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. I have 7 surgeries scheduled for next week. A teacher with pancreatic cancer who spent her life savings on her students' supplies. a firefighter who developed tumors from exposure during 9/11's rescue operations, a single mother who's been fighting her insurance company for months to get the treatment she needs. I scrolled through more files. These are the people who deserve my technique. These are the people who earned my time and expertise by being decent human beings. My father had 43 years, 2 lifetimes, to earn my compassion. He chose to spend that time earning my hatred instead. Carmen nodded slowly. I understand. And for what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. She squeezed my shoulder gently. I'll do everything I can for him with conventional methods. But Mira, don't let this consume you. Don't let his poison spread to the rest of your life. It won't, I assured her. This chapter is over. I have a whole life to live, and I plan to live it well. 3 months later, I stood in my office overlooking the city, reading Carmen's latest update on my father's condition. The surgery had failed, as expected. The cancer had spread too aggressively for conventional methods to contain. He had perhaps another month to live. The knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. Come in, I called. To my surprise, it was my mother. She looked better than she had in years. The therapy I'd arranged for her was working, and she'd finally found the strength to leave my father and start over. I thought you should know, she said quietly. He's asking for you again. I set down the medical report and turned to face her. What did you tell him? That you're busy saving lives, she said with a small smile. Which is true. It is, I agreed. I have 3 surgeries tomorrow, 2 research papers to review, and a presentation to prepare for the International Medical Conference next month. She nodded, then hesitated. He's really dying, Mira, if you want to say goodbye. I said everything I needed to say 3 months ago, I replied, and so did he. She studied my face carefully. Are you happy? Really happy? Or are you just satisfied? It was a good question. Was I happy or just vindicated? I thought about my life as it was now. I had work that fulfilled me, colleagues who respected me, patients who trusted me with their lives. I had my mother back, healthy and strong for the first time in decades. I had a beautiful apartment, financial security, and the respect of my peers. Most importantly, I had peace. The little girl who had spent her first life desperate for her father's approval was finally quiet. The young woman who had died believing she was worthless had been replaced by someone who knew her own value. I'm happy, I said, and I meant it. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I'm genuinely happy. She smiled and kissed my forehead. That's all I ever wanted for you. After she left, I returned to my work. There were lives to save, techniques to perfect, a future to build. My father's dying screams were just background noise now, no more significant than the hum of the air conditioning or the distant sound of traffic. 1 month later, I received the call I'd been expecting. My father had died in his sleep, alone, except for the night nurse. Linda had been arrested for drug possession 2 weeks earlier. Jessica was facing fraud charges and would likely spend the next 5 years in prison. I felt nothing. No sadness, no relief, no closure, just nothing. It was over. The funeral was small. A handful of distant relatives, a few neighbors, Carmen, who came to support me, and my mother, who attended more out of habit than grief. I wore my best black dress and stood in the back, watching as they lowered the coffin into the ground. During the brief service, the minister spoke about forgiveness and redemption, about how death makes us all equal in the end. I didn't disagree with him, but I didn't agree either. Some people earn forgiveness, others don't. Some people deserve redemption. Others squander every chance they're given. My father had chosen his path. I had simply chosen not to rescue him from the consequences. After the service, as the small crowd dispersed, I found myself alone at the graveside. The headstone was simple. David Chen, 1962 to 2025, husband and father. Husband and father. The word seemed almost mockingly inadequate given the complexity of his legacy. But then again, maybe they were exactly right. He had been a husband to 3 different women, one of whom he'd hidden from the others. He had been a father to 2 daughters he'd systematically destroyed and one he'd abandoned. He'd just been very, very bad at both roles.